The hearing room wasn't quiet, not the kind of quiet you get in a library, but the loaded kind, where every shuffle of paper and click of a pen feels like it could ignite something. Representative Jasmine Crockett adjusted her chair, the leather creaking just enough to announce she was ready. Across from her sat Florida Governor Ron DeSantis, suit crisp, tie perfect, posture textbook, the portrait of political self-assurance. Today's topic was public education funding, but it was clear to everyone in the room this wasn't going to be a polite policy discussion. DeSantis had been making the rounds on cable news for weeks, touting his parental rights reforms and bragging about his ability to clean up school curriculums. Crockett knew his record went deeper than slogans. She'd come armed with facts, stories, and enough receipts to drown the talking points. As the chair recognized him, DeSantis leaned forward, smiling faintly, like he was already winning. Representative Crockett, he began, voice calm but carrying an unmistakable edge, you've been critical of the education reforms we've implemented in Florida. But let me ask you, how do you justify defending systems that fail our kids year after year? The question hung in the air, deceptively simple. Cameras zoomed in. Staffers stopped typing. Crockett didn't blink. She reached for her pen, tapped it once on her binder, then met his eyes. Governor, she said evenly, I'll answer your question, but first, let's talk about what failure really looks like. A flicker crossed DeSantis' face, not fear, but a flash of awareness. The kind you get when you realize you've walked straight into a fight you didn't prepare for. This wasn't going to be about polite exchanges. This was about dismantling the confidence of a man who'd built his entire image on never losing ground. DeSantis kept the faint smile, the kind that says I've handled tougher rooms than this. Failure looks like test scores that don't move, he replied, palms open in faux plain-spokenness, and classrooms where parents have no say. Florida fixed that. We set standards. We protected kids. Crockett didn't look at him when she answered, she looked at the cameras. Protected them from what, Governor, long division or libraries? She slid a tabbed sheet forward. While you were taking victory laps, teacher vacancies in your state hit record highs. Districts filled classrooms with long-term subs because certified educators fled. That's not parental empowerment. That's a system bleeding out. He leaned into the mic. We raised teacher pay. She pivoted the page, steady as a surgeon. Entry pay, barely. Meanwhile you spent months waging a culture war on the curriculum instead of funding counselors, HVAC repairs, and STEM labs. You banned books faster than you fixed roofs. Call it what you want, students call it fewer adults and colder classrooms. A low murmur, the sound of staffers rechecking notes. DeSantis cleared his throat. Parents deserve control. Parents deserve capacity, Crockett said, voice even. Show me the capacity, buses that arrive, Wi-Fi that works, schools that stay open after a hurricane instead of serving as photo ops. She let that hang, then added, softer, deadlier, you like to say Florida is where woke goes to die. Funny, because underfunding is where potential goes to die. The smile thinned. He reached for the familiar trench. We expanded choice. Families can leave failing schools. And you called it freedom, she replied, while siphoning tax dollars into vouchers for private campuses that can expel the very kids public schools must serve, ELL students, kids with IEPs, teens who ask hard questions. That isn't freedom, that's triage with a press release. Crockett finally turned to face him fully. You asked about justifying failure. I'm asking you to recognize ownership. If the scoreboard is your measure, then own the injuries you inflicted to get there. For the first time, his smile didn't answer back. It held, but it didn't convince. The room could feel it, a hairline crack in confidence, widening with every measured sentence from the woman across the table. The crack widened when Crockett reached for a slim blue folder, one she hadn't touched until now. She laid it flat, opened it with deliberate care, and revealed a series of photographs, crowded classrooms, ceiling tiles stained brown from leaks, rusted playground equipment behind chain-link fences. She didn't narrate them at first. She let the images work. These are Florida public schools, she said finally, her voice still level but stripped of any performative edge. taken this year. I didn't pull them from an advocacy group. They came from parents, your voters, who emailed my office because they couldn't get a call back from yours." DeSantis glanced down, just long enough to register the authenticity. "We're addressing infrastructure," he said quickly. "With what funds?" Crockett countered, flipping to a budget chart. "The same funds you cut from maintenance to expand administrative offices? Or the ones you redirected to private contracts with zero transparency clauses? You want to talk about failure? Here it is in black and white, $250 billion in budget reallocations, while roofs collapse over cafeterias." The room tensed. A reporter's pen scratched faster. Someone in the back whispered, "She's got him." DeSantis tried to pivot. "Florida is a model for..." "A model for what?" Crockett's voice sharpened just a notch, not a shout, but a blade. "For gutting the system you're bragging about? For selling the idea that test prep and censorship are educational reform?" He straightened his tie. "Our scores are climbing." "And our dropout rates?" she asked. "Our suicide rates among LGBTQ+ teens? Our shortages in bilingual educators? You don't get to cherry-pick stats and call it leadership." A pause. Then Crockett leaned in, her eyes never leaving his. "Governor, confidence is a dangerous currency in politics. It buys you room to dodge, to spin, to dismiss. But here's the thing, when the receipts hit the table, that currency devalues fast. And right now, yours is in freefall." The smile was gone. Only a fixed jaw remained. Cameras caught it, and the viral moment was brewing. The shadow she cast was no longer metaphor, it was swallowing the space between them. Crockett didn't waste time. "Let's talk about the books," she said, flipping to a spreadsheet with dozens of highlighted titles. "These aren't extremist manifestos, Governor. They're history texts, novels, biographies, pulled from shelves under your so-called curriculum transparency laws. Parents didn't get empowered. Kids got silenced." DeSantis exhaled slowly, the kind of breath meant to buy time. "We've removed material inappropriate for minors." "Inappropriate by whose standard?" she cut in. "By the committee of political appointees you handpicked? Or the out-of-state lobbyists who supplied your review lists?" She tapped the sheet. "To Kill a Mockingbird. The Bluest Eye. Even a Rosa Parks biography was flagged. You tell me, are these a threat to children, or just to the narrative you're selling?" The governor's jaw set tighter. "Florida stands for protecting innocence." "Innocence?" Crockett's voice softened, but her words hit harder. "Innocence is a 9-year-old who can't explain why her favorite book disappeared from the library. Innocence is a history teacher who now skips entire chapters because she's afraid of losing her job. What you're protecting is not innocence, it's ignorance." That last line drew a sharp intake of breath from somewhere in the gallery. Reporters' pens flew. Crockett leaned back slightly, giving him room to respond, an opening he didn't take. His silence wasn't deference, it was calculation, but in a hearing room filled with cameras, calculation looks like hesitation. She pressed again. "Governor, I'm not here to score soundbites. I'm here to document the real cost of your agenda. Every time you strip context from a curriculum, you strip capacity from a generation. And I promise you, history will remember that." The shadow in the metaphor was getting denser now, stretching across the table. And in it, the governor's confidence, once immovable, was beginning to shrink. DeSantis adjusted his mic, leaning forward as if proximity could reclaim control. "Representative Crockett, Florida's families are voting with their feet. People are moving to our state in record numbers. That's proof our policies work." Crockett didn't flinch. "They're moving to Florida, Governor, but they're not moving into your public schools. Enrollment in private voucher programs is up because you've starved the public system into desperation. Parents aren't leaving failing schools because they want to, they're leaving because you made failure the only option." He opened his mouth, but she didn't give him the beat he needed. "And while you're touting migration as an endorsement, you ignore the teachers migrating out, veteran educators who spent decades building communities now working in warehouses or leaving the profession entirely because Florida turned them into political targets. DeSantis sat back, hands folded tightly. We've increased choice and accountability. Accountability? She slid a new page across the table. Here's accountability, a Department of Education audit from last quarter showing over $16 million in misspent voucher funds, taxpayer money, paid to schools with no certified teachers, no disability services, and in some cases, no functioning bathrooms. This isn't innovation. It's neglect with better PR. The gallery was dead quiet now, every head swiveling between them like a slow-motion rally. Governor, Crockett said finally, confidence is easy when you control the microphone. But when you have to answer to the people your policies have hurt? That confidence starts to look like arrogance, and arrogance collapses fast under sunlight. For the first time, the faint flush in his cheeks betrayed him. It wasn't defeat yet, but the arc was bending, and everyone in the room could feel where it was headed. Crockett let the silence hang just long enough to feel like pressure. Then, with deliberate calm, she reached for a slim binder labeled Hurricane Recovery Funds. Governor, she began, Florida's a state that knows disaster, storms, floods, wildfires. You've been in charge through some of the worst, and you've had the chance to show what leadership looks like under pressure. She flipped a tab. But your administration redirected $8 million earmarked for rebuilding schools after Hurricane Ian, into marketing contracts for school choice awareness. While roofs in Lee County still leak. DeSantis's brow furrowed. That's a mischaracterization. It's an audit, she said, her voice slicing through. And the audit doesn't mischaracterize anything. It says, and I quote, funds reallocated without adequate justification. That's a polite way of saying your priorities didn't match the needs on the ground. He tried to pivot. Families needed options. They needed classrooms, Crockett cut in, sharper now. They needed heat-resistant windows, mold remediation, rebuilt playgrounds. Instead, they got billboards telling them where they could send their kids, if they could afford the transportation and if the receiving school would even take them. The governor tightened his grip on the mic. We met the needs we could. No, Governor, she said, leaning in so the space between them seemed to narrow. You met the needs that fit your talking points. And you left the rest, kids in temporary trailers, teachers buying air purifiers out of their own paychecks, to fend for themselves. A low murmur rolled through the room. It wasn't outrage yet, it was recognition. And recognition, Crockett knew, was the first crack in the wall of political invulnerability. Crockett shifted gears without warning, her tone softening in a way that made the next words hit even harder. Governor, I talked to a mother in Fort Myers last month, her son's in 4th grade. His school cafeteria has a ceiling tarp to catch rainwater. Every time there's a storm, the lunchroom smells like mildew. That boy has asthma. She's had to pick him up from school 5 times this year because he couldn't breathe. DeSantis straightened, but she didn't give him space to respond. You talk about protecting families. But what protection is it when a child can't even finish lunch without a trip to the ER? He exhaled, slow, calculated. We're addressing facilities. After how many storms, she pressed. After how many hearings like this one? You've been in office long enough to know that every hurricane season is a countdown. The question is, who's ready when it hits, and who's still writing press releases while kids get sick? She flipped to another page, this time, photos of the cafeteria, time-stamped, each one showing the same blue tarp in place over the span of months. This, she said, tapping the images, is not a natural disaster anymore. It's a man-made one. You had the budget. You had the authority. You just didn't have the will. The governor's smile, small, practiced, finally faltered. The cameras caught it, and Crockett knew it would loop online within hours. Because sometimes, the most viral moments aren't the loudest, they're the ones where the silence on the other side says everything. Crockett leaned back, as if giving him space to recover, then dropped the next blow with surgical precision. Governor, you've built a brand on the idea that Florida is the freest state in the nation. But tell me, how free is a teacher who has to submit their lesson plans for political review? How free is a librarian who has to lock books in a closet until they're cleared? How free is a high school senior who can't take an advanced placement history course because it's been stripped from the curriculum? DeSantis's fingers drummed against the table, soft, but noticeable to anyone watching closely. Our reforms ensure parents have a voice, he said. Parents already had a voice, Crockett countered. What you've given them is a veto, and in some cases, the power to erase entire stories from the classroom. That's not democracy, Governor. That's control with a smile. She slid forward another document, an email chain obtained through a public records request. In it, state officials discussed removing certain historical content because, quote, it might cause discomfort. History is discomfort, she said, her voice cutting through the hushed air. It's supposed to challenge us. And if you're leading a state that can't handle a hard truth, you're not leading, you're babysitting fear. The room went still. No coughs. No whispers. Just the sound of every lens and microphone pointed directly at him. For a man who thrived on public confrontation, DeSantis suddenly looked like someone hoping for the clock to run out. Crockett's tone shifted again, no longer just pressing, but cutting to the core. Governor, you keep talking about protecting the next generation. But I've read your budget proposals. You cut funding for mental health counselors in public schools by 12% last year. At the same time, you increased allocations for school safety officers, which, in reality, means more law enforcement and fewer people trained to actually help a struggling kid before a crisis happens. DeSantis's eyes narrowed. Safety is our first priority. She leaned forward. Then why is Florida ranked 48th in the nation for student mental health access? Why are students waiting months for counseling referrals, if they get them at all, while your administration spends millions on legal battles over classroom speech? He tried to pivot. We've invested in prevention measures. This is prevention, she snapped back. You can't police away depression. You can't handcuff anxiety. You can't legislate trauma into disappearing. But you can address it, if you choose to. And right now, you're choosing headlines over help. There was movement in the gallery, a parent shaking their head, a reporter raising an eyebrow. The optics weren't on his side. Crockett paused, letting the weight of her words settle before she added, almost in a whisper, you say you want to make Florida a model for the nation. If this is the model, Governor, then you're showing America how to fail children in plain sight. It wasn't the loudest moment of the hearing, but it was the one that made the governor's jaw tighten and his pen stop moving entirely. Crockett closed her binder at last, signaling she was done with the paper trail. What came next was pure conviction. Governor, you've had the privilege of leading one of the most resource-rich states in the country. You've had budget surpluses most states would dream of. And yet, here we are, kids in temporary trailers, teachers leaving in droves, parents begging for basic repairs while your administration spends its political capital on culture wars. DeSantis shifted in his chair, eyes fixed on the table. You can talk migration numbers, you can talk tax cuts, you can talk about how Florida is a success story. But success for who? The families who can afford to navigate your maze of vouchers and private options? Or the ones who get left behind in the system you've gutted? Her voice didn't rise, it didn't need to. Confidence without accountability is just performance. And performance doesn't rebuild classrooms, it doesn't clean the mold out of cafeterias, and it doesn't save a kid from a panic attack in a hallway with no counselor in sight. She stood, pushing her chair back slowly. So, Governor, you can keep telling America that Florida is the freest state in the nation. But until freedom includes every child in every school, public or private, that's not freedom. That's a sales pitch. The room was silent, the air charged. Every camera caught his stillness, and every viewer knew what they were seeing, the moment confidence cracked. And let me leave you with this: politics is full of people who can deliver a great soundbite. But real leadership is about delivering results. If a leader can't stand in front of the people most affected by their policies and answer for them without hiding behind slogans, then they're not leading, they're performing. I didn't come here today to trade barbs or chase headlines. I came here to put facts, faces, and lives on the record, because every parent, every teacher, and every student deserves to be seen and heard in these halls. Governor, you may be used to controlling the narrative, but the truth doesn't need your permission to exist. And no matter how many microphones you stand behind, it will follow you, until you face it, or it faces you.